Close your eyes for just a moment and think back to Britain in the 1960s. The streets were alive with color, with noise, and with cars that every single family on your road seemed to own. These weren't just machines, they were part of life itself. The 1960s were something else entirely for Britain. The country was changing fast, new music, new fashion, new confidence, and right in the middle of all that energy were the cars. From terrace streets in Manchester to country lanes in Kent, the roads told their own story. Families were growing, wages were slowly rising, and for millions of ordinary people, owning a car for the first time wasn't just a dream anymore, it was actually happening. Today on Britain Rewind, we're counting down 10 cars that absolutely dominated British roads during that extraordinary decade. Some of them you'll recognize instantly. But the one sitting at number 1 might just surprise you more than you expect. Number 10. Triumph Herald. There are cars you remember for their speed, and then there are cars you remember for something far more personal than that. The Triumph Herald arrived in 1959 and quickly became a familiar face on British streets right through the 1960s. Built by Standard Triumph in Coventry, it was designed as an accessible, stylish family car for everyday people who wanted something with a bit more character than the usual offering. What made people genuinely fall for the Herald was its turning circle. It could spin almost on the spot, which made it brilliantly practical in tight town streets and cramped British car parks. It also had a clever one-piece bonnet that flipped fully forward, making home maintenance refreshingly simple for the weekend mechanic in the driveway. The reality, though, was that rust attacked these cars with remarkable enthusiasm, and reliability wasn't always guaranteed. But for thousands of British families, the Herald was their very first taste of motoring freedom, and that memory never really fades. Number 9. Hillman Minkx. If the 1960s had a definition of dependable, Hillman Minkx would have been standing right next to the word in the dictionary. The Hillman Minkx had actually been around since the 1930s, but it was during the 1960s that it truly settled into the rhythm of British daily life. Built by the Roots Group in Coventry, the Minkx was aimed squarely at the practical family, spacious enough for 4, affordable enough to actually buy, and sensible enough that your dad would nod approvingly in the showroom. People loved it because it asked nothing extraordinary of them. It started, it drove, it got you where you needed to go. The problem was it never really excited anyone either, and as sharper, newer alternatives began appearing, the Minkx quietly started losing ground. Still, in its heyday, you couldn't drive through a British suburb without spotting at least 2 or 3 of them parked nose to nose along the curb. Number 8. Vauxhall Victor. The Vauxhall Victor FB arrived in 1961, replacing the slightly more flamboyant original, and it brought with it cleaner lines and a more grown-up sense of purpose. Vauxhall, then a subsidiary of General Motors, produced the Victor at their Luton plant, positioning it as a mid-range family saloon with enough space and comfort to feel like a small luxury. Drivers liked its roomy interior, decent boot, and the fact that it felt solidly planted on the road compared to some of its rivals. However, rust became the Victor's most notorious companion, and these cars could corrode with almost breathtaking speed in a damp British climate. Mechanics dreaded working on the flaws of older examples. Despite that, the Victor was a genuinely popular sight throughout the decade, a car that represented quiet, honest aspiration for Middle England. Number 7. Austin A40 Farina. Before the hatchback became the dominant shape on British roads, one small car quietly pointed everyone in exactly that direction. The Austin A40 Farina was launched in 1958 and carried on well into the 1960s, designed with input from the legendary Italian styling house Pininfarina, which was genuinely remarkable for a modest British family car of that era. Built by BMC in Birmingham, the A40 was compact, economical, and surprisingly stylish for its price point. It featured a rear tailgate, a proper early version of what we now call a hatchback, which made loading shopping or luggage far more practical than most of its contemporaries could manage. People adored its neat, continental look and its frugal engine that sipped rather than gulped at the petrol pump. It wasn't perfect, the interior was fairly Spartan and power was modest, but it represented genuine forward-thinking in an era when British motoring was beginning to find its confidence. Number 6. Rover P5. While most cars on this list were built for the working family, Rover P5 was built for the people who ran the country. The Rover P5 entered production in 1958 and remained in service well into the 1970s, making the 1960s the absolute peak of its authority on British roads. Built at Rover's Solihull factory, the P5 was a large, stately saloon aimed at senior professionals, government officials, and anyone who needed their car to communicate quiet, serious power without being ostentatious about it. Prime ministers were driven in them. Cabinet ministers arrived in them at Whitehall. The V8 engine coupe version, added in 1967, gave the P5 a new layer of muscular elegance that made it impossible to ignore. People loved its sense of occasion. Stepping out of a P5 felt like an event in itself. It was expensive, it was thirsty, and maintenance wasn't cheap, but for those who could afford it, the Rover P5 was Britain in a car. And if you've it this far, stay with us, because the car sitting at number 1 didn't just sell in enormous numbers. It genuinely changed the way Britain thought about itself, about its roads, and about what a car could actually mean to ordinary people. You won't want to miss it. Number 5. Ford Anglia 105e. There are cars that children grew up drawing in their school exercise books, and Ford Anglia 105e was absolutely one of them. The Ford Anglia 105e launched in 1959 and became one of the most recognizable shapes on British roads throughout the entire 1960s. Ford built it at their Dagenham plant in Essex, and they designed it with that distinctive reverse-rake rear window that made it look unlike almost anything else on the road at the time. It was affordable, cheerful, and exactly what millions of young British families needed as car ownership began spreading beyond the professional classes for the first time. People loved the Anglia because it felt modern without being intimidating, and it was genuinely fun to drive in a simple, uncomplicated way. The engine was small but willing, the handling was lively, and parts were plentiful. Rust was a concern, as it was for almost everything from this era, but the Anglia's personality was strong enough that people forgave it almost everything. It was the car of a generation growing up and going places. Number 4. Hillman Imp. When Britain decided it needed a rival to the Mini, Hillman Imp was the car that stepped forward to try. The Hillman Imp launched in 1963 and was built by the Rootes Group at a brand new factory in Linwood, Scotland, a plant constructed specifically to bring jobs and industry to the Central Belt. It was a rear-engined, rear-wheel drive small car with genuine engineering ambition behind it, featuring an aluminium overhead cam engine that was technically rather impressive for a small economy car of its time. Drivers who gave it a proper chance often fell in love with its agility and its surprisingly sporty character through corners. The problem was that the Imp arrived with serious quality control issues, particularly around the cooling system and the automatic choke, and its reputation suffered badly in those early years. The Linwood factory itself was plagued with industrial disputes throughout the decade. Yet despite everything, the Imp found its audience, especially in Scotland, and those who owned one in good condition swore there was nothing quite like it on a winding road. Number 3. Morris Minor 1000. If Britain's roads had a heartbeat in the 1960s, Morris Minor 1000 was probably sitting right at the center of it. The Morris Minor had been with Britain since 1948, designed by the brilliant Alec Isigonis, the same man who would later give the world the Mini, and by the 1960s it had become as much a part of the landscape as red telephone boxes and corner shops. BMC kept producing the Minor 1000 all the way through to 1971. Meaning an entire generation grew up seeing it outside their front door every single morning. People loved it with a depth of feeling that went beyond rational explanation. It was honest, practical, charming, and it had a face that somehow seemed to smile at you. The rounded bodywork aged beautifully, the interior was simple but functional, and the car felt genuinely manageable for drivers of all kinds. Rust was, as always, the enemy, but the Minor fought it off in people's affections regardless. Families put hundreds of thousands of miles on these cars and kept them going through sheer loyalty and love. Number 2. Ford Cortina Mk1. In 1962, Ford of Britain did something extraordinary. They built a car that seemed to be exactly what every single person in the country wanted at exactly the right moment. The Ford Cortina Mk1 launched that year from the Dagenham factory and became an almost instant phenomenon. It was light, modern, spacious, and priced at a point that made it genuinely accessible to the growing British working and middle class. Fleet buyers loved it, families loved it, young drivers loved it, and even the motorsport world took notice when a specially prepared Lotus Cortina version began winning races with brilliant regularity. The Cortina represented a new kind of confidence in British motoring, practical but not boring, affordable but not cheap feeling. Ford's parts network meant keeping one on the road was never an impossible task. Yes, rust came for them in time, as it came for everything. But the Cortina's footprint on 1960s Britain was enormous. You can still hear older relatives speak its name with a particular kind of warmth that tells you everything you need to know about what it meant to them. Number 1. BMC Mini. And here we are. If you've been watching from the very beginning of this video, you may have seen this coming, but that doesn't make it any less deserved. Because no car in British history has ever earned its place at the top of a list quite like this one. The Mini was born in 1959, created by Alec Isigonis in response to the Suez Crisis and the urgent need for a genuinely economical small car that Britain could call its own. Built by BMC at plants in Longbridge and Cowley, the Mini redefined what a small car could be. Its transverse engine and front-wheel drive layout put 80% of the car's footprint inside the wheels, creating interior space that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It was revolutionary in the most complete sense of the word. Throughout the 1960s, the Mini wasn't just popular, it was everywhere. It crossed every social boundary that British cars had ever respected. Working-class families drove them to the factory. Fashion designers drove them down the King's Road. Racing drivers threw them around circuits and won. There was simply no other car on Earth that belonged so completely to a decade, a nation, and a moment in time. The Mini didn't just rule British streets in the 1960s, it became Britain's streets. And 60-plus years later, that truth has never really changed. The 1960s were a time when Britain was finding itself, in its music, in its culture, and yes, in its cars. These weren't just vehicles. They were the backdrop to childhoods, the transport to first jobs, the setting for family holidays that live on in faded photographs. Every car on this list carried real people through real moments, and that's something no amount of time can take away. If one of these cars brought a memory rushing back for you today, we'd love to know which one in the comments below. Give this video a like if you enjoyed the ride, subscribe so you never miss a journey back in time, and we'll see you in the next one.